Hi, it's Pastor Steve, continuing our journey cover to cover. Today we finish the book of Genesis. Today is January 18, and we're looking at Genesis 47 all the way to the end of the book, which is chapter 50. And today is an extremely important day in terms of the whole biblical narrative. First of all, we're going to have the last words of Jacob as he blesses his kids. And we're wrapping up the story of Joseph. Now, from the time that Jacob has joined his lost son Joseph in Egypt, 17 years have gone by. So that's a long time that Jacob, as a very old man, has had the opportunity to be with his son Joseph. And now he is 147 years old, which is really old from our perspective. And he is about to go the way of his fathers. And before he passes, we have an unusual phrase. He asks Joseph to see him with his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and he tells Joseph, "Put your hand on my thigh." Now, that is a biblical idiom. It could be literally, "Put your hand on my testicles." I know that sounds kind of weird from our perspective, but the Hebrew word actually consists of that genital area. And the point is, I'm talking about passing on blessing, of asking you to be genuine and answer. It's basically saying, I am honoring this swear, this promise on my children. So as odd as it sounds from our perspective, it meant that this is a very serious request. And in the process, it comes down to bury me in my own land, not here in Egypt. But then comes something very interesting, because Jacob then says, I'm taking your sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and they're going to be considered my sons. Now, why is that important? It basically means that the position of firstborn, which should have been Reuben, has now been given to Joseph, in that he is getting a double portion. He is usurping Reuben, if you will, as the person who is the one in the highest position among the brothers. But he does something else, though. Joseph places Manasseh near his right hand, and then he places Reuben near his left hand, and then Daddy crosses his hands, and Joseph's concerned about this. But what Jacob says is that Ephraim is going to be the more prestigious son. And later on in biblical history, one of the most important biblical characters in the Bible, we'll bump into him a little bit later, Joshua, the commander who conquers the promised land, is from Ephraim. And so we see in this Joseph elevated and then Ephraim above Manasseh. As we move on and we listen to the blessing, I want you to take note of something else. Jacob talks about Abraham having walked with God. This becomes, for the rest of the Bible, an idiom of following after the Lord, to which I could say today, I walk with Jesus, or I walk with the Lord. That is not speaking of, there were two footprints in the sand and I walked with Jesus. It literally means I am a follower, in this case, of Yahweh, of the Lord. And that will be a phrase that we shall see all through the biblical narrative. Now we move to the blessing of all of the kids. Now this is interesting in its own way, because when he starts blessing, in our world we think of blessing as something like you sneeze and somebody says, God bless you. For them it is a portrayal of a prophetic word of honor or even rebuke. Now, I have behind me here on the computer artist's depiction of Jacob blessing his children. In this particular picture, he has his hands on Joseph himself, but he does that for each of his kids. He starts off with Reuben, and he actually doesn't have nice words. And you may not remember this, but Reuben slept with Jacob's concubine, Bilhah, probably to establish his own patriarchal authority in the family. But Jacob has never forgotten this and is quite angry at it. So his blessing is not much of a blessing. But when we move to Judah, this is the most important blessing. First of all, we see that all the brothers are going to bow down to Judah, which speaks of an authority that's coming. Judah is called a lion's cub. Now, refer later on in the book of Revelation, Jesus will be called the Lion of Judah. This comes from this verse, so it's very important. Then he says, the scepter will not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes. Now, different translations have different words. The New Living Translation that most of you are reading doesn't have that word Shiloh. But many consider that a word that the scepter until Messiah comes. Very interesting. There is a Jewish paraphrase called the Targum, which seems to translate it that way. And we come now, after the blessings, to probably what I would call, if not the most important verse in Genesis, one of the most important verses, and that is Genesis 50:20. Now, here's the context. The brothers come to Joseph and said, your father said you should forgive us. And we don't have a record of Daddy having ever asked Joseph to do that. They could be lying. We're not sure. This is the only passage where the brothers truly, though, apologize for what they did to Joseph. But verse 20 of chapter 50, Joseph says these profound words. What you did was for evil, but God meant it for good and for the saving of thousands. That verse is so crucial to understand that God can redeem the worst things that we have done. That is the majesty, the beauty, the wonder of God, and that we see in this passage. Finally, the last thing I want to point out is that Joseph and Jacob are the only two people listed in the Bible for having been embalmed. So that's interesting. Little note in and of itself. Tomorrow we begin a whole new journey looking at the book of Job. God bless you. We'll see you soon.